leading the way, has reached the home of American racing. We are in Lexington, Kentucky at the Breeders' Cup offices, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Dora Delgado, the Executive Vice President of Breeders' Cup. Now tell us, where did this love of horses and horse racing first start off?
Probably from birth. My grandfather was a thoroughbred trainer here, based here in Lexington. We lived in an apartment above the barn, and as a young woman, it was a love affair from day one. Every girl has a love affair with horses, and mine was no different. So I spent a lot of time around horses, had my own. But really was never thinking that I was going to have a career in horse racing. But when Breeders' Cup was just a fledgling organization, they needed some summer help, and I was in between high school and college, and thought I'll go type a few things and file a few things, and it'll make a little extra money.
And was that the first? When Breeders' Cup started, in terms of when was the first Breeders' Cup?
The first Breeders' Cup was in 1984. So in the spring of '82, John Gaines had announced at a Derby luncheon that he had this great idea for horse racing, because we didn't have a year-end fall championships. So he launched his idea. His vision was one day of races, seven races worth $10 million. So it was revolutionary. It was unheard of in horse racing. I think at that time we had the Arlington Million. I think there was maybe one or two other races around the world that had $1 million purse, but one day of $10 million on the line was something the world had never heard of.
And did it have international vision, or was it, to start off with, we needed something to sort of close off the American season?
That was exactly it. We had the spring classics, and you had the summer derbies, but there was nothing that said, here the season is culminating here, and we're going to bring East Coast horses and West Coast horses in the Midwest to compete against each other. They would all stay, pretty much where they are. Some did some traveling, but nobody had said, we're going to create a center stage, and we're going to bring everybody here to compete and see who the world's best at. And from day one, it was so important that we had that international component. So we spent a lot of time recruiting in Great Britain and making sure those horses from France and Ireland and England all came to compete as well. Back in the early days of Breeders' Cup, there were no boundaries. We had no square we were living in, because it hadn't been done. So there was some freedom of thought and freedom of ideas, and everybody's opinion was valid. And so it was a real defining moment for me that I could be involved in horse racing at an administrative executive type level.
And does that continue to this day, in terms of the adversity to risk is zero? Let's go and try something new.
It really is. I mean, we don't have a formula other than the one of making sure we provide the best fan experience. And because Breeders' Cup we're not an invitational event. We have 14 races to fill, which means we have to recruit a lot of horses, right? We need them from all over the world. So we don't set really limits on that. What will it take to get those horses here? And if that's, great parties, and if that's executive car service, and we try to arrange the flights for horses, those are all things that are on the table, right? Because we're very fond of saying we're going to have 14 really happy people on Saturday night, but there's going to be a whole lot of other people whose experience has to have been one of the best that they've ever had. And there's so much competition for Grade 1 horses, right? There's so many invitational race meets around the world, so many just really glamorous. Royal Ascot and the Melbourne Festival, and Hong Kong puts on a good show. So when you're competing at that kind of level, you really just have to put everything on the table and say, what is it going to take to make this event better than last year's? And just keep raising the bar.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to take you back a good few years now, and in terms of, we're looking at on a diversity and inclusion front, especially on a gender diversity front, where UK racing is predominantly male driven, although it has been getting a lot better over the last decade in terms of some amazing women coming into our sport. How have you felt that's happened in American racing?
I think it's a work in progress. Breeders' Cup has always been a very inclusive organization. In terms of gender, I would say 50-50 on terms of male versus female staffing. There's always been opportunities, though there's the ladder, does not reach a glass ceiling here, which I'm very proud to say. It's not the same always, and it's not the same at every place we go and other organizations that we deal with. But we're hoping, that there's a real movement afoot, because there's so many great women now being put in positions where they're going to make a real difference. I think doors are being opened and they're not shutting back on us, which is what we all want.
Fantastic, because at the end of the day, we need the teenagers or Gen Z to look up at our sport and see something that's reflective of society, or something that looks like them, be it gender diversity or be it ethnic diversity. And how have you seen on the ethnic diversity front? US racing, to me, which is why we're here, it seems it's huge within the horseman population, but how does it reflect that into the administrative side of the sport?
You know, it's interesting when you look at the history of American racing and the importance of a diversified group of people that were, back in the day where we had more African American representation in trainers and jockeys and owners even, and how that cycled up and then back down again. And we've been talking internally among some of our organizations about how do we get that back, and there's a couple of groups that are working on that really hard. They're building some syndicates to bring African American and people of color back into the business, which we're incredibly supportive of. I think there was a certain stigma of because so many years of people of color being used as grooms and stable help and not in positions of importance, I think, in their minds in the horse business, that there was a certain backlash to that. So I think there was a certain stigma in that it would be detrimental to how others viewed their race.
Can you give us some advice for getting more young women into our sport? How do we sell it to them? How do we get through to them?
Right, and there's never been a group more ripe for picking than young women who love horses, right? It should be an easy conversion, but we're not showing them all the variety of jobs that can be done in the horse industry. We did a really interesting graphic in our work with the Thoroughbred Safety Coalition, where we were trying to show all the touch points of a horse and the concentric circles that grew out from one animal about all the individuals and groups that had something to do with horses, show you that there's just an incredible diversity of jobs where you can be involved in the horse business, and we're doing a very poor job of showing that to young people. And so I think that would probably be first on my list is let's work together to say, here's the entire laundry list of how you can be involved in the horse business. Because a lot like I was when I was young, right? You don't have to be a groom, you don't have to be a hot walker. There are a myriad of jobs available to you, from broadcast to veterinary work to insurance. I mean, for gosh sakes, there's just so much. And the horse industry needs those people.
And everyone says it's everyone's job, but if that happens, it can actually fill through the cracks, and it's no one's job, and it's getting that sort of centralisation of whose role it is. Is there someone sort of leading the way in the US for that to happen?
I don't think so. I think it's a position that we really need to spend some time on. We've spent a lot of time making sure the horse has been put at the pinnacle of our efforts in the last couple of years with safety and integrity. So now we can turn our attention to educational programs, diversity programs, inclusion, but it will take somebody leading that, and one of the things that we talked about before was, who's going to fund this? We keep going to the well for the same people to keep funding aftercare and backstretch communities and permanently disabled jockeys fund, and they are, to be honest, tapped out. But so we have to come up with a funding mechanism. We have to come up with an educational type person.
So in the UK, we've brought about over the last 3 or 4 years a diversity and inclusion commitment, where various organisations in the UK have committed to improve the D&I side of the sport. Is there anything like that in the US?
Not to date. It is something that a lot of people are talking about in this industry. I think in American racing, there is a tendency to kind of wait and see who's going to step across the line. I think we're in the same position with diversity and inclusion. People are waiting for someone to take the lead. I think there's probably a hesitation on Breeders' Cup's part to say, are we really the one that should be leading this charge? It's not really our mission statement. It's not really our focus. There are other organizations that probably could do a better job of leading that charge that we would support. But at the end of the day, if nobody steps in to fill that void, I think Breeders' Cup would definitely take the lead on that.